Welcome to the Artist Talk with Johan Gelper. Johan is a Belgian artist, living and working in Ghent, a city famous for its rebelliousness, and herewith is a city with a dynamic and unconventional art scene. Johan Gelper specializes in large-scale, site-specific and mixed-media sculptures, often making use of recycled materials. One has to walk around the sculptures in order to attain a more complete experience of them. The works are in fact sculptural events that are activated by the viewer's real-time, multisensory perception. Behind Johan's work, there is a lot of research and experimentation. Geotropism is one of the notions that Johan borrows from the botanics. Geotropism is the response of plants to gravity. Next to demountable spatial drawings, that's the title for the exhibition, we present a selection of Johan Gelper 2D drawings. Their composition is often the result of an intuitive merging of botanical drawings and technical design. In this way, they are somewhere between an unfettered écriture automatique. Johan, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Julia invited me to do a talk, and I recently, by coincidence, was invited to do a talk with a webinar with all the lockdown years and so on. And they asked, it was some academy in India, and they do talks about color from all disciplines. And I found this very interesting to think about abstracting as color, because I'm actually a painter, I make sculptures. It made me think, and I also, besides painting, I also studied mixed media. It was some sort of more conceptual approach at the academy at KASK in Ghent. And they always said it's important to learn how to talk about it. And I found it interesting to talk about something as abstract as color. And it was also the invitation that made me think about it. And this was in an older sculpture similar to the works here, but also where you can see color. For instance, the mint green tube. You have paints, you have a botanical element, you have lines that are, for me, drawings. Like a line can be on paper, but it can also be in space. I'm not new with that. There is a whole history of drawing in space. I recently saw that there might be some spatial drawings in Zurich also, but it's always fascinated me, like from painting. I did a lot of drawing as a student, and it always stayed like color as a theme through my work. But I like to start with this photograph. Last year I had a visit from, today it's all like things with Instagram, and there was a photographer, portrait photographer. Her name is Georgia Di Tria, and she asked, can I travel to Ghent and take photos of your studio? She saw a photo of my studio. And this is one of the photos she made. I chose it to have it in the keynote because it's backside of my studio. And I found it interesting because it might appear chaotic. So you have, like, for someone, when you enter, you've been there and you enter the space, there's one part it's works everywhere. And it's not only finished works, it's mainly materials, I have a very organic working method. And I show it because in fact it looks chaotic, but there is a structure in it. And this structure actually is also the content of my work. So for me, like my working methods and the form or the way it works they coincide. I try to make things that are layered in this way. So they have all different contents. Every material also has a story. Sometimes it can be a story from where I found it, but it's an extra layer that might be interesting, but it's not necessary to know the whole story, because I also try to look for abstract works. But so this was to illustrate the working method, which is organic. So I'm a studio artist. I spend lots of time in this studio. Sometimes in winter it's cold, and then I go in my house to do drawings. But it's like I'm not a desk artist. I'm a painter. I work with materials. collect materials, I paint them, I remove paint and make layerings, but also in content they're layered. These are examples of spatial drawings. That's the title of the exhibition here. I added 2 spatial drawings, demountable spatial drawings. I will explain that later. But these are examples of the line in space as a tube, painted tube, or here fiberglass loops that become in front of a white wall, that's the paper, become drawing. So, and also in a photograph, you clearly see from 3D to 2 dimensions. So I work in different dimensions. Also, this mixed media I studied, the idea was also that the medium you work in, it's not so much about the medium, it's much more what you do with it or what you choose to use to tell your story. That's the most important. That's what I also try to do. So I don't have, like, for me, painting can be also a sculpture or the other way around. So I don't have these boxes for each discipline. Yeah, and there's all kinds of details. Like this one, it's like with a pencil, like
the brush.
Yeah, I think it's spatial squiggles. This is a very early one. The other one, it's from the tonneau chair. It's one of the first elements. Maybe that's one of the stories, like the tonneau chair, this form, and in some sculptures you see here also you have this loop. And it was when I started working from painting to sculpture, my parents bought new chairs for the kitchen. And they had these old IKEA replicas of tonneau. They were for the trash, but I thought maybe I can use them. And the first thing I did was, because I was painting, was stretching canvases over this wood. So you had like this wall objects that became spatial sculptures at the same time. But this was an element that became part of my my language, and it always reappears in another form or with so a chair is a found object that I often use. This is another example of my studio. It's the other side of the studio. The other side, I'm lucky I have lots of daylight from the roof, but there's one corner in the back and I try to keep it as clean as possible. It's a difficult space because lots of moisture and behind the wood is brick walls and so on. But I always try to keep this part clean and it's to reflect. So then objects enter my studio. In the middle part, they're all on the walls, and I keep them long, sometimes for like years. Some are there like 5 years or even more. And slowly they become part of new works, of sculptures. And in the end, I like the works that come here. I select this, and so to reflect on that, I use photography. So that's why I have this corner. When a sculptures looks finished, they're actually never finished. But if I'm happy with it to make an exhibition with a certain piece, I put it there. I photograph all sides, and I go home, put it in my computer, and that's a way to make distance from the works I make, because like when I'm in the studio, it's like a dive. You go into the work and it's never ending. So that's why, in a way, they're never finished. And I explain later how that also became part of the content of the works, because you could say they're sculpture, but actually I'm an installation artist, because each sculpture is part of a larger spatial drawing. So the demountable spatial drawing, it is more like a metaphor for my working method, for the body of works, all the works together. And I took it kind of literally. This was selecting colors. So these are examples from the walls. Some are sculptures in the back, like here they're small objects, but some are just objects that seem to remind me of sculpture. Like this, it's a plate from an oven. I painted it one layer of paint and it became like a very concrete art, like an abstract thing that worked with color, with metal paint, and the same happened with these round objects. It's all just very ordinary objects. I prefer things that not like gold or bronze, but just the arte povera of those things are interesting. I keep them on the wall. Sometimes it becomes part. This one ended up in a sculpture, but sometimes it's just for color to remind me, and it's my color palette. Usually I start with color from how I find the color, but often later on I go add paint. So it's not only the found object as it is, I also rework it. And there's an example in the exhibition also, because a lot of people ask me what's with the pink, or there were plastic lines that I found in an in situ exhibition. And I usually, when I find a material that's interesting, I keep it as it is. But when I have like this creative flow, I also start for making new works, experimenting with those materials. So it's just the idea what would happen if I added paint, what paint should I use, and I try all these things, I do experiments, and that's how the green ones, the two green sculptures are also about color, about botanics also. That's why the title is Botanical Monochrome, also monochrome in art history with painting. These are objects on the wall, and this is an example how these objects can become part of installation that is demountable. This is a test setup for an exhibition I made in Belgium. I always do that when it's installation. Works here are more like sculptural, but often I go make for a specific location, site-specific works like that. And they're combinings of all these objects. Some are things that are waiting to become sculptures, some are finished sculptures, like these two. They're now here in the show. So maybe on this time I took the photo, I didn't know yet if there would be sculpture or not. But that's how it's a mix of finished things and things that can become something else. And that's also important, like the found materials. It's like I choose things that are not art because I find it interesting to make something like a new aesthetic of things that people found not aesthetic. It's a bit like Dadaism, like Kurt Schwitters. It's very inspiring for me, and also the arte povera. So art history is also one of the layers I like to refer to, but in my own language. And also the found objects, because like with the opening, and lots of people ask that, or they say, oh, you often go to markets and things to buy old things or to collect old things. That's actually not the case. It all comes very spontaneously or naturally. It's sometimes as simple as walking from my house to my studio. Like this, I found this big rock from the pedestrian walk also. I live in Ghent, so we have all these old blue stones, and I was a bit shocked that they took those away to make a new concrete sidewalk. And I asked those workers, what are you going to do with it? And they would make little wax for it. So I asked, if I give you a beer, can I have this wax? And I would have this big rock in my studio. It's like 200 kilos, but I know it's a beautiful object, and I'm going to make a sculpture with it one day. And that's how. So I have many stories how objects. Sometimes it's things people give to me also, but it's not like today I'm going to the market to find objects I can work with. These are other examples of this setup, two compositions, and the other one is in the exhibition space. But you also see a difference, and that's what these were about also in this keynote about color, how color can change, so simultaneous color. It's the same like in the color theory of Joseph Albers, which I also have a link with one of the sculptures. And that's how I see color also. And it's also interesting, also like constructivists in a way, because I believe like the constructivists used to say that the sculpture is not the thing on its own, it is also the space around it. And that's always, that's why I choose to make these ephemeral, transparent elements, and with color, it's just to illustrate how a work can change from its surroundings, literally. Sometimes I do also smaller works, and this was also an example of the walls in my studio are like my palette. Not with paint on a palette, but it's all these objects by hanging them, a bit like the drawings I did here, but it's much more filled with all kinds of things, and they, like color, this way enters my work and becomes a personal palette, like a certain artist, certain colors he prefers on his palette also. The other one is a colorful work with those objects, and that's why this is here, like this piece. It's not a series, but these were an edition. I was working on an edition for SMAC in Ghent. It's a museum in Ghent, and friends of SMAC, they sometimes invite artists to do an edition. And for me, I wanted to do unique pieces, so I was thinking about that. And there were lots of these like leftovers, and it became later part of this larger sculpture. So that's again this working methods. These are also just examples with color. Sometimes it's adding paint. This is just the color as I found it. Like these are the plastics, just a combination, the contrast here, the orange and the mint green are as I found it. This was also the metal. While this one is a much older work, it's one of the botanicals I used to make with plastic tubes. So I cut all these plastic tubes in little tubes, and it's with wires for electric cables. I added them, and then I painted it with spray paint. So sometimes I keep painting like a classic painter by adding paint also. These are more like visual poetry. In a way, because it's much more about combination. It's just two objects, combine them, but these are also here because of the color, because sometimes it's just a little element that can give them a contrast, and it's about, I like to refer to the arte povera, the idea about culture and nature, and it's not that I'm an arte povera artist, because I'm not Italian, I'm not from that era and so on, but it's inspiring for these works also. These are another two examples. These are some works that I also find it important not to have some works like a poem. If you analyze the poem and you explain everything, it takes a bit away of the magic. So sometimes it's just works that should speak for themselves. But like the gardening tools, they're also an element that reappears, like the tonneau chair I explained before. This is another example of my studio and the final work. And this one is where you can see how objects is the experimentation with adding paints afterwards and installing the works. This test setup was also part of this sculpture in the middle. So smaller sculptures, like this one, are also other sculptures. So elements from this sculpture are also in this composition. So they're literally demountable, mostly with larger pieces. They're not only a large sculpture as you see on here, which I also later had in an exhibition outdoors, but they're also the elements, like for the exhibition here also, I had to demount the works to do the transport also, but in this way, when it's demountable, you can also remount two sculptures instead of one to a new sculpture, for instance. And that's also what I often do in the installation work in the in situ. And for instance, when you go outdoors, it's something that looks tall and monumental in your studio becomes tiny in open air. So that's why I add these elements. They're in a way like modules that I use. like these chair frames become abstract structures, and these structures can be modules. I often use certain clamps to install those. This was also sculpture outdoors. This is in it because of color also. It was in a park, it was for Art Brussels. I was invited to do present the work in a park, and it was also in spring and with green. So the story about this sculpture is I just moved to the space I'm not working now in my studio. Before I had a smaller space. When I came there were like there were four welding tables, but they were completely rusted and they were not usable anymore. They were, and the owner wanted to throw them away for old scrap metal, but I said, maybe I can do something with it. And I made from these tables these sculptures. They refer to me also to art history. Like yesterday I saw some sculptures of David Smith also, and you also in like the English sculpture you have like Anthony Caro, who makes also spatial drawings, and then I make this link. Just for me that's enough to start thinking about it. And then I added, because of the environment, like the constructivists, the green environment, I thought red can be interesting because it's the contrast, there are complementary in color. And so with paints, so certain color also entered this working method, like objects, because when you have to paint rusted steel, there's not much choice in paint. So you have this gamma of colors, and I had to work with, and I often use these colors because of that, for a technical reason. And I also use them to paint other objects. And the same is with the other ones. Like at a certain point, you have like really thin lines in space that are very fine, and if you have a large pot of paint, you have lots of paint left. So I started using models for like little planes, the little paints, which also has typical colors, and that's how my color palette becomes my color palette. So from that point of view. This is another one with the other two tables. It's the same. The paint is the red steel paint, and this green, and that's a problem now because they stopped making this paint, and it was like my chosen color for certain. It's also in the one on the right there, the green line in the botanical construction over there. Yeah, and here you also see these garden tools again. If you would, it's a bit small, but this is like a garden tool. Sometimes it was also at first a wooden tool, but I changed it to metal, and I painted the metal as if it looks like wood. So sometimes I also do that. These are also with tables, with colors, and these colors are the colors from the models you use for small models like a ship or a plane or so. Because it's all these thin lines, and I found it also interesting because often these colors, they're like pastel-like, somewhat kitsch-like, but it's also like not art. So again, this choice of material. This was an exhibition in Leuven in M Museum, curated exhibition, and I made. This is the similar story. This is made of, in this space there were the four tables, the welding tables, but the previous artist was a painter, and he divided the space in different smaller rooms, and he had this window. It's like a window. But it was, I needed more space, so I removed it, and I used this window by removing the glass and adding two elements, like a structure for a sculpture, and in this structure I made this spatial drawing. At the time I also could do an exhibition in Rotterdam, where they have a large Naum Gabo sculpture, and at that time they were restoring it. There was a lot in the news that it was such a shame that it was all rusted, and they Now it's restored, and that inspired me also because I went to Rotterdam, and then I found out this marvelous oeuvre of Naum Gabo, and somehow it's inspired by different materials. The materials are the tent sticks. I also often use, like there's a few in here, since the beginning also to make these spatial drawings. So the tent sticks are for camping, like you have an igloo tent. It's what I started with these forms. Also this loop became like a module also. I hope one day to make one in, nowadays you can have in steel, like with 3D printed things. So I hope one day I can propose outdoor sculpture. Maybe it's more a dream, but but in a way at first they're very simple, like, and they become a form which ends up in the work. But this is mainly here, also because of the color. Because in the beginning the sculpture was without this yellow part, and I just added it. It was actually a dishcloth on the floor to clean up sculptures or my studio, but it was just by adding it by coincidence that it made a shift. It made it much more playful, which I liked, which fits the language I was looking for.
May I interrupt you maybe here? As I told you yesterday before, and some of the guests know Jaco Schissa, who is famous for a term, like an implemented term into art history as willful obstinacy, so Eigensinn. And he believes that there is a certain Eigensinn in each material that we use. So meaning that, like, also in this case, maybe this yellowish cloth wanted to be there, right? Like it has its own will to jump into the artwork and making it there. Do you also have a feeling that some of the materials, they actually, rebellious in that sense, and they want to enter your work nevertheless? I mean,
I guess so. It's very intuitively that it's,
okay.
Yeah. And I found it interesting that somehow you find something new, but then if I rethink it, and I think, oh no, I did this exactly the same like many years ago, and that's so.
And you say that some of the works are changing its form and shape and construction from time to time. So it means that you have, like, the exhibitions which you make, they are like records of the works, right? Like, but the works are not final; they always transform.
Yes,
and the work becomes final only when it's kind of out of your reach. So it lands up in the collection or something. Then you can't touch it anymore. And then it's final.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I recently had another studio visit also, and people ask that, but it's true. If as long as things are in my studio, it's possible that I work it. And a good example is the drawings here, because like it was lots of drawings, but some are collages, and like I made like the dots is from a perforator is it English, to make holes in the paper, from another drawing that I when you draw you make like 20 and maybe 5 are okay, and the rest you look at later, and like this one pile ends up like cutouts that become elements that other artists might throw away in the trash, but I keep them all. And then because it has color that can be interesting in another collage. So many of the works with collage are actually the collages. There's one with a photo, I think, but the rest is like other drawings that are cut out and repasted.
It's also very sustainable in this sense, ecological. Do you also have? Do you also think about this aspect, like being ecological, being sustainable? I mean, it's very trendy at the moment, but probably it's not your primary aim.
Yeah, it was. Well, I started in 2006, so it was more from a creative process at first, but of course it's also another layer. I think it's important to be ecological nowadays, of course. Yeah. But it's inspired because I'm not the first artist. I try to make something a personal language with it, because like assemblage, you have like Kurt Schwitters and all these Also the combinings of Rauschenberg and all this history, and it's very inspiring. So but nature also. I grew up I'm living in Ghent now, but I grew up in a region where there's lots of woods, and I remember even when I was a kid, there were always more, certainly in Belgium, more houses, more concrete, more streets, and like the trees I used to climb in, they disappeared. So I've always been interested in nature and the importance of it also, and it's certainly a layer that is.
I have maybe another question to you concerning the being a Belgian. What does it mean? I mean, we see certain reflections of your in your art of Magritte, for example, this special humor which he used to have, and like some, I mean, the Belgians have it in their like mentality, in their tradition. Could you maybe define other like qualities of Belgian people in your work, maybe, or the way you think?
Well, Magritte, I remember I had in this mixed media a teacher. He was Danny Matthijs. I don't know but he was quite famous long ago. In Belgium you had Jan Hoet, the curator of SMAC, and he did lots of things. And I remember that he used to talk a lot about Magritte. And I also remember before, as a painter, that I was more like painting for me was more the paint and the material. But he told us like Magritte is like the first conceptual artist, and that was inspiring, and I learned how to look different because it's also very tourists-like, the Magritte. It's famous surrealism, like chocolate and beer and so on. The umbrellas, indeed, it's a very interesting work of Magritte with the umbrella and the painting, but these are more like, they're also old elements from very early sculpture where I used the metal structure of the umbrella to mimic plants also. And these handles are the leftovers, and that I think last year refound. So I never throw anything away, but because I know one day it might be interesting for a new sculpture, and it's like a combination. Like, I don't know if you saw before, there was a few, I think when you just entered, I had like these combinations of a root and a garden tool in the photos. It's a similar work, like it's somehow fitted. It's like combining things that at first don't fit, but just because of that become a new aesthetic, and it's selecting like that. I work very intuitively, so there's like, what I don't do is I was always interested in abstract painting, and that's why it is about color, and because it becomes abstract also, and it has like, it's about in some sort of intuition to me. So it's not conceptualized, like a color has no symbolic meaning, or so, like with the pink sculptures, it's by coincidence, and I don't think about maybe it's too pink, or it's too this or that. Like, you have artists that have like restrictions and say, I only use these colors, they're very interesting, but for me it's like much more like instinct, like intuitive, organic process. So maybe it might be a bit metaphysical in a way, but I'm more interested in philosophy, like from painting. We talked about it yesterday. I had a teacher at St. Lucas, the painting school, and he knew everything about Maurice Merleau-Ponty and the painters, the modern painters like Cézanne, Paul Klee, and also how they work and how they use abstraction as a way to keep a work open for interpretation. And that's also important for me. And another one, because you spoke of Magritte, but there's also more near to Ghent, we have Roger Laveel, He was last year a big exhibition at Beaux-Arts also. He's less famous because he never left Belgium. He lived in a small village, but he was like very important. Also because he did pop art before they started, they say so. Although he wouldn't like it if you said it was pop art. But if you know or don't know, you should certainly look at Roger Ravel, because he's a big inspiration, because he always said a painting has to be not abstract and not figuratively either. And it's a big inspiration for me too. Because of that reason, it's a bit also like modernism, like Cézanne said, paintings should be open for interpretation also.
Would you consider yourself a conceptual artist?
Well, it's a good question. What is a conceptual artist?
Sorry, I was trying to provoke, because we label conceptual art, but in some way it is conceptual, but you leave this place that is not logical, rational, so somehow.
Well, this working method became a concept. But it's not like because I don't like, but nowadays everyone knows, like history is not straight, not linear. So like when you could also think about like conceptual art, the minimalists in America, it's different than that, because they often use restrictions. And that's something I don't do, but I always think content is very important, like the conceptualists also did. At first it was about removing everything and to bring everything to the content of the works. And from there it's important for me also, but it's like this demountable spatial drawing became a concept in a way. It's often working and reworking, and at a certain point it's like the work tells me it's good because it fits this language, and the transparency, the openness, or the ephemeral part is also important. And there's also other artists that worked with this ephemeral idea. And also in contemporary art, it's something that interests me also in works of other artists also. They're all very fragile, but by that it gives a shift. And that's one of the elements. Another element is like some sort of humor, like with the dishcloth. It's like it's not supposed to be in there. It's not. It's something you don't relate to as art, but by adding it, it shifts something that makes it a new aesthetic. And that's what I always look for. And it's just, the rest is in instinct, intuitive working and reflecting and selecting these works. I don't think the rest is photos of like this also, for color, what happens with the space. This was an old factory they would demolish also. So this is the test setup, the same work. With the blue, the orange becomes much brighter, so again, an example of simultaneous color for this. And then this is another one that's a very good example how a sculpture can also be an element, like a component of an installation for me. Because this is, as it is, a sculpture. But then I later use this sculpture as a pedestal. I never use pedestals unless it's like Brancusi. We said like the pedestal is a part of the work. So, and this one became the pedestal for this demountable spatial drawing, which is also a site-specific installation work. So, and actually in this composition, they're all parts of other works. So from this composition, I can deconstruct or I can demount them and make a show of 10 sculptures also. So that's somehow also, it's more older works. In the beginning, I used to do lots of installation work in Ghent and around. And here you can see the elements when they're uninstalled. But like the other sculptures, like this one on the left, was also in this composition here. And this one, the works on the wall, it was a group show. They're from other artists. Last summer, for a group show, and it was in an old, it was a strange location. It was an old tax building in Diksmuide, of all places. It was also a strange place where you don't have many artists or art scene or anything. But it was very strange for architecture. It was like a 70s building, and the colors were all like this modernist pastel. There were 3 levels. Each level had like one was yellow, the other one was mint green, and the other one was blue. This light blue, all these colors that nowadays are more kitsch-like. And this space was the kitchen, so it was a group show to do only site-specific work. So all artists were invited to go there, to camp there, to make works with what's there, because the building would be demolished and we could use everything. For me, there was a problem with time, so we visited with a group, we looked at all the spaces, and I immediately was fascinated by the plastic blinds. Not because of their color, but because of their lines, their material. I could draw it in space. And the link was from this, the exhibition had a title which was about the building. So I thought, why not do something with the blinds and replace the tent sticks I usually use, or the fiberglass, with these plastic elements. But this room was twice or triple times as big as this part, and all these windows were all these pink blinds, and I took them all with me with the car, because I had to teach also, and they ended up in my studio, and it was like, whoa. It's like, maybe I think the photo is on your website, and that fascinated me, that it had such an effect, all these, like, from black drawings to like this color. And I kept them like that, and I started making several sculptures. And then the first one, and that's also about color, that was a link with art history, because I think it's in here, it's this one. It's the first one I made, and it was somehow a coincidence, but maybe not at the same time. I'm also a teacher, I have to teach painting, and I know a bit about Joseph Albers and color theory. And this was just from internet nowadays. There's so many images, and I found this old black and white photo of paper sculpture not from Joseph Albers, but a student. It was anonymous, so I don't know who made it. But I thought, hey, this is a ribbon, like the same as the paper was used in the paper sculpture. Why not just for fun try to copy it?
But it also reminds of Daniel Burin, like in many ways.
It's possible, but that was what I did at first, and then I started, and I liked it as a floor piece because it reminded me like abstract sculpture in New British sculpture, and you have like also there's in London you have this pink sculpture also from it's one of the important, I forgot his name, but it's an important. No, it's like you have like Anthony Caro, David Smith, and so. But there's another one also who has a famous work. It's a coin, and it's also a pink sculpture. So I thought, yeah, it's a color used in sculpture, and why not? It's interesting. But it can be just the copy of the Joseph Albers sculpture, and then I looked for elements surrounding, like the elements I use in collage, and it became this brick. Somehow it's the same color family, like you have it's a monochrome in this way, and that it's all intuitively somehow it came there was a layering in linked to art history, and that's how I ended up in some creative flow with those pink plastic blinds. And I added then the bricks because like this, it's also, it has, to me, it had this structure, had a dynamic I liked. It has a repetition, and by putting them like that, it's like gravity, and it reminds me again of a plant, so that made sense, like the botanical elements. And that was what was in the text also, I think, about this presentation. It is about the language of botanics in this way, but also the language of sculpture. The language of sculpture, it's about gravity, about balance, about all those things. And that's all these layers in this work. And then later on it became, and that's the geotropism part, I then made like...
Maybe we can move to that space and Johan can explain more on geotropism, and we'll prepare in the meantime the branch part, okay? And then we just like set in the flow of communication. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone.